Law, empire, religion, and early states. Circa 2000 to 1000 BCE. Section 1. A world of kings, gods, traders, and laws. Around 2000 BCE, the ancient world entered a new age of power. The first cities had already risen. Writing had already appeared. Kings had already claimed divine authority. Temples, palaces, scribes, merchants, farmers, soldiers, priests, and laborers had already become part of civilization's machinery. But between 2000 and 1000 BCE, that machinery grew larger. Kingdoms expanded, empires formed, law was written in stone. Trade networks crossed deserts and mountains. Religions preserved sacred memory. Bronze weapons and chariots reshaped war. Great kings exchanged letters, gifts, brides, threats, and treaties. Old powers rose. Old powers fell. New peoples appeared in the written record. And across different regions of the world, states began building systems that would influence humanity for thousands of years. This was not one story. It was many stories unfolding at once. In Mesopotamia, merchants from Assur carried tin and textiles into Anatolia. In Babylon, Hammurabi linked kingship with law and justice. In Anatolia, the Hittites built an empire that rivaled Egypt. In China, Shang kings carved questions into bone and bronze. In South Asia, Vedic poets preserved hymns in memory before they were written down. In Egypt, the new kingdom became an imperial power, and pharaohs like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Akhenaten, and Ramesses II reshaped the Nile world. In the eastern Mediterranean, palace systems rose into wealth and then collapsed into fire, famine, migration, and fragmentation. Iron began spreading, slowly replacing bronze in some regions. The Zhou overthrew the Shang and justified conquest with the mandate of heaven. Israelite identity emerged in Canaan, and later traditions remembered Saul, David, and Solomon. And far across the ocean, in Mesoamerica, the Olmec world began to rise independently, building ceremonial centers and colossal stone heads. This was the age when ancient states became larger, more complex, and more vulnerable. The age of law, the age of empire, the age of sacred tradition, the age of collapse and renewal. Section 2. Old Assyrian merchants and the trade roads of Anatolia. Around 2000 BCE, before Assyria became the terrifying military empire of later centuries, the city of Assur was already powerful in a different way, through trade. Old Assyrian merchants built one of the most remarkable commercial networks of the Bronze Age. Their caravans travelled from northern Mesopotamia into Anatolia, carrying goods across hundreds of miles. They did not move only armies, they moved textiles, tin, silver, contracts, letters, family instructions, business partnerships, debt records, legal disputes. At Kadesh, also known as Kultepe, in central Anatolia, thousands of cuneiform tablets preserve the private lives of merchants, families, wives, husbands, creditors, debtors, and trading partners. These were not only royal inscriptions, they were business documents, a world of commerce written in clay. Merchants from Assur transported textiles and tin into Anatolia. Tin was especially important because it was needed to make bronze when alloyed with copper. In return, merchants sought silver and other goods. The trade was difficult. Caravans crossed mountains and dangerous routes. Donkeys carried loads. Investors backed journeys. Officials taxed goods. Families negotiated risk. Disputes arose over unpaid debts, missing cargo, dishonest partners, and failed shipments. Women participated actively in this economy. They managed households, produced textiles, corresponded with husbands, handled property, and sometimes pushed back in letters against business decisions made far away. This is one of the great strengths of the Old Assyrian archive. It shows civilization not only from the top down, but from the inside. Not only kings, not only temples, not only wars, but merchants arguing over money, wives managing production, families separated by trade, contracts binding strangers across distance. The Old Assyrian network shows that Bronze Age civilization was not only built by conquest, it was also built by trade, by trust, by risk, by written agreements, by merchants carrying the materials that made bronze possible. The world of 2000 BCE was already deeply connected, and wherever goods moved, ideas moved with them. Section 3. The ancestral traditions of the Hebrews. In later biblical tradition, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph were set in a world resembling the early second millennium BCE. These stories are about movement, families, pastoral life, covenant, promise, exile, return, famine, faith, land. They tell of ancestors moving through Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, and the spaces between settled cities and open grazing lands. To Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, these figures would become foundational. Abraham would become a patriarch remembered across three major religious traditions. But the historian has to be careful. The traditional setting of a story is not the same as the date when the story was written down. Archaeology has not confirmed Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob as identifiable historical individuals. No surviving document from the second millennium BCE names them directly. The stories may preserve older memories, names, cultural settings, and ancestral traditions, but they were transmitted orally, reshaped across generations, and written down much later. So in this part of the timeline, we are not saying that the Hebrew Bible already existed in completed form around 1900 BCE. It did not. We are seeing the traditional world in which later Israelite memory placed its ancestors. The history of ancient Israel becomes more visible much later. Around 1208 BCE, the Egyptian Merneptah stele gives the earliest widely accepted extra-biblical reference to a people called Israel. Then, in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, archaeology shows many small settlements appearing in the central highlands of Canaan. Many scholars interpret these settlements as part of a gradual process of Israelite identity formation. Not necessarily one sudden invasion, not a complete replacement of Canaan's people, but a transformation within the populations of the land. Local groups changed, new identities formed, old traditions were remembered. Names, stories, gods, ancestors, and land claims became part of a developing people. The biblical texts themselves were composed and edited over many later centuries. But the traditions they preserve became powerful because they gave a people a memory of origin. In an age of kings and empires, the ancestral stories of the Hebrews told another kind of history. A history of family, covenant, wandering, promise, and a relationship between a people, their God, and the land. Section 4. Hammurabi and the Law of Babylon. Around 1792 BCE, Hammurabi became king of Babylon. At first, Babylon was not the greatest power in Mesopotamia. It was a relatively small Amorite kingdom surrounded by rivals. Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, Assyria. Other city-states and kingdoms competed for land, canals, tribute, trade routes, and divine favor. Hammurabi inherited a dangerous world. He survived it through diplomacy, alliance, war, administration, canal management, and religious patronage. For much of his reign, he maneuvered carefully. He made alliances. He waited. He fought at the right time. And late in his reign, he defeated his major rivals and brought much of Mesopotamia under Babylonian authority. The empire he built did not remain intact for long after his death, but Babylon's importance had changed forever. Babylon became one of the great political and religious centers of Mesopotamia, and Hammurabi became famous for law. His law monument shows the king standing before Shamash, the god associated with justice. At the top, divine authority and royal authority meet. Below, the text presents Hammurabi as a king chosen to establish order. The monument contains a prologue, hundreds of legal provisions, and an epilogue. The laws deal with contracts, loans, debt, marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, slavery, theft, agricultural damage, irrigation responsibility, wages, medical fees, injury, false accusation, judicial procedure. This was not the first law in history. Law existed long before Hammurabi. Customs, contracts, judgments, oaths, compensation systems, and earlier written law collections already existed in Mesopotamia. Ur-Nammu, Lipit Ishtar, and Eshnunna all came before Hammurabi's famous monument. But Hammurabi's collection survived in extraordinary form, and its scale made it one of the most famous legal texts in world history. It was not modern equality before the law. Penalties changed according to social status. The free person, the dependent person, and the enslaved person were not treated equally. The phrase "an eye for an eye" applied only in specific circumstances. Justice was structured by hierarchy. The rich, poor, free, and enslaved lived under different consequences. The monument was also not necessarily a complete statute book like a modern legal code. It was a curated display of royal justice, a legal, educational, political, and religious statement. It said that the king stood between the gods and society, that he defended order, that he protected the weak, at least in royal ideology, that justice could be written, that law could be remembered, that power could present itself as righteousness. Hammurabi's Babylon did not last as a unified empire for centuries, but his law monument lasted in human memory. It became a symbol of the Bronze Age state, written law, royal justice, divine authority, and social hierarchy carved into stone. Section 5. The Hittites and the Powers of Anatolia. While Babylon rose in Mesopotamia, Anatolia became home to another major power, the Hittites. Beginning around the 17th century, BCE, the Hittite kingdom developed in central Anatolia, with its capital at Hattusa. From there, it became one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age. The Hittites spoke an Indo-European language. They used cuneiform writing. They adopted and adapted religious and political traditions from many peoples around them: Hattian, Hurrian, Luwian, Mesopotamian, Anatolian. The Hittite world was not culturally simple. It was a mixture, a kingdom built from conquest, diplomacy, treaty, ritual, and adaptation. Hittite kings ruled from fortified cities. They made treaties with vassals. They kept archives. They fought over Syria. They competed with Egypt, Mitanni, Assyria, and other states for influence. They became masters of diplomacy as well as war. Their texts preserve treaties, prayers, rituals, myths, laws, military records, and international letters. The Hittite state was important because it reveals the interconnected nature of the Late Bronze Age. No great kingdom lived alone. Egypt watched Hatti. Hatti watched Assyria. Mitanni struggled between larger powers. Babylonia negotiated. Canaanite cities shifted loyalty. Syria became a contested zone between empires. Bronze Age power was a balance of armies, marriages, gifts, letters, oaths, hostages, tribute, and gods. The Hittites were not a side story. They were central to the international order. Their rise set the stage for one of the most famous confrontations of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh. Section 6. The Minoans, Mycenaeans, Mitanni, Kassites, and Middle Assyria. Between roughly 1700 and 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia became a web of powerful states and palace systems. On Crete, Minoan palace centres flourished. They built complex architectural centres at places such as Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. They used a writing system called Linear A, which remains undeciphered. They participated in Aegean trade. They produced fine art, frescoes, ceramics, storage systems, and ritual spaces. The Minoan world was maritime, palace-centered, and deeply connected to the sea. Later, on mainland Greece, Mycenaean rulers built palace states. They used Linear B, an early form of Greek. Their tablets recorded land, livestock, workers, textiles, weapons, offerings, and palace administration. Mycenaean centres such as Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Tiryns were part of a warrior elite world of palaces, fortified citadels, chariots, bronze weapons, and far-reaching exchange. In northern Mesopotamia and Syria, the Mitanni kingdom rose. Mitanni was ruled by elites whose world combined Hurrian-speaking populations with Indo-Aryan elements, visible in some royal and chariot terminology. It became a major power between Egypt, Hatti, and Assyria. In Babylonia, Kassite rulers governed for centuries after the decline of Old Babylonian power. They preserved Babylonian culture while participating in the late Bronze Age diplomatic world. Assyria, meanwhile, began transforming from a commercial and regional power into a more aggressive state. Middle Assyria expanded through warfare, administration, deportation, and royal ambition. These states were not isolated. They wrote letters. They exchanged royal gifts. They married daughters into foreign courts. They sent gold, lapis lazuli, horses, chariots, textiles, and luxury goods. They negotiated borders and complained about insults. The Late Bronze Age was a world of great kings: Egypt, Hatti, Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni. They recognized one another, competed with one another, and depended on one another. This was international politics before the modern world, a system of royal brotherhood and rivalry, a world where diplomacy could hold empires together, and where the breaking of that system could help bring catastrophe. Section 7. The Shang dynasty and the bones that spoke. Around 1600 BCE, in northern China, the Shang dynasty rose. The Shang is the earliest Chinese dynasty supported by both extensive archaeological evidence and contemporary written records. Its world was built around royal lineages, walled settlements, agriculture, warfare, ritual, bronze production, and ancestor worship. The Shang king was not only a political ruler, he was a ritual mediator. He communicated with royal ancestors. He asked questions of the unseen world. He sought guidance about harvests, weather, warfare, hunting, childbirth, illness, sacrifices, dreams, and travel. The most powerful surviving evidence comes from oracle bones, cattle shoulder blades, turtle plastrons. Royal diviners carved questions into them. They applied heat, Cracks appeared. The cracks were interpreted. Sometimes the inscriptions recorded the question, sometimes the prediction, sometimes the result. These oracle bones preserve the earliest extensive readable Chinese writing. They show rulers, wars, sacrifices, officials, royal women, ancestors, weather, agriculture, and belief. The script was already highly developed, with structural continuity leading toward later Chinese writing. The Shang state was not a modern territorial empire with uniform administration everywhere. Its power was strongest near the royal centre and depended on aristocratic lineages, warfare, tribute, alliances, and ritual authority. Bronze was central to Shang power. Shang metalworkers mastered piece mold casting and produced elaborate ritual vessels, weapons, bells, and fittings. Bronze vessels were used in offerings to ancestors. They were not merely objects of beauty, they were instruments of ritual and authority. To produce them required mines, transport, furnaces, artisans, moulds, fuel, and control of valuable resources. One of the most remarkable Shang figures was Fu Hao. She was a wife of King Wu Ding. Her tomb contained weapons, bronzes, jades, and inscriptions showing that she held religious, political, and military status. She led military campaigns. She participated in ritual. She stood near the center of Shang power. The Shang world shows another path of early civilization. Not the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, not the pyramids of Egypt, but bones, bronzes, ancestors, and kingship in northern China. A civilization asking the future questions by carving them into bone. Section 8. Vedic Culture in South Asia. After the decline of the mature Harappan urban system around 1900 BCE, South Asia did not become empty. Regional communities continued. Agriculture continued. Trade continued. Local traditions evolved. And during the later second millennium BCE, Indo-Aryan-speaking communities developed Vedic culture in northwestern South Asia. This was not a simple story of one invading people replacing everyone else. The evidence points toward migration, interaction, intermarriage, language change, and cultural transformation. The oldest Vedic collection is the Rig Veda. It was composed in archaic Vedic Sanskrit and preserved orally through highly disciplined memorization. Before it was written, it lived in sound, in recitation, in memory, in ritual. Vedic poets composed hymns to deities and cosmic powers. Indra, associated with storms, warfare, and victory. Agni, the sacred fire and messenger of sacrifice. Soma, both a ritual substance and divine force. Varuna, connected with cosmic and moral order. Ushas, the dawn. Surya, the sun. The Vedic world centered on sacrifice, sacred speech, cattle, warfare, rain, fire, cosmic order, and relationships between humans and divine powers. Ritual specialists preserved the hymns and performed ceremonies intended to secure prosperity, sons, cattle, victory, rain, and balance. These traditions became one major foundation of later Hinduism, but early Vedic religion was not identical to later Hinduism. Major later developments such as karma, rebirth, moksha, philosophical monism, temple worship, and the great devotional traditions of Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess developed or expanded over later centuries. The social categories later called Varna began appearing in Vedic literature, but the full complexity of later caste systems should not be projected unchanged into this early period. Vedic culture shows that not all great historical memory began with writing. In South Asia, sacred tradition survived through the human voice, careful repetition, oral discipline, sound as preservation. The Vedas remind us that writing is not the only way civilization remembers. Sometimes memory is carried in breath. Section 9, New Kingdom Egypt, Empire on the Nile. Around 1550 BCE, Egypt entered one of the most powerful periods in its history, the New Kingdom. It began when Amos I defeated the Hyksos rulers of northern Egypt, reunited the land, and expanded Egyptian power. The trauma of foreign rule helped reshape Egyptian military ambition. Egypt became more aggressive, more imperial, more outward-looking. Its power stretched south into Nubia and north into Canaan and Syria. The New Kingdom was supported by professional military forces, chariots, fortresses, garrisons, tribute, diplomacy, royal marriages, gold, temples, and trade routes. Egypt was no longer only the great kingdom of the Nile. It was a major imperial power in the eastern Mediterranean and northeast Africa. Egyptian control varied from place to place. Some territories were directly administered. Others remained under local rulers who acknowledged Egyptian power. Some sent tribute, some provided military support, some rebelled, some shifted loyalty between Egypt and rival powers. The New Kingdom was an imperial network, not a modern state with identical rule everywhere. Hatshepsut ruled in the 15th century BCE, first as regent and then as pharaoh. She built monuments, restored temples, commissioned her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, sponsored trade expeditions, including the famous journey to Punt. She used royal imagery in ways that adapted traditional kingship to a female ruler. Her reign is often remembered as peaceful, but her government also maintained Egypt's military and imperial interests. Thutmose III became one of Egypt's greatest military rulers. His campaigns in the Levant strengthened Egyptian influence over Canaanite and Syrian rulers. At Megiddo, he won a major victory that helped secure Egyptian dominance over a network of vassals. Egypt's empire depended not only on conquest, but on administration, tribute, hostages, diplomacy, and temple wealth. New Kingdom Egypt also participated in a wider international system. The Amarna letters reveal rulers calling one another brothers, exchanging gold, luxury objects, brides, demands, and complaints. The pharaoh was a god king at home, but abroad he was one great king among other great kings. Egypt was powerful, but it was not alone. Section 10. Akhenaten and the Aten Revolution. Around 1353 BCE, a pharaoh came to power under the name Amenhotep IV. He would become known as Akhenaten. His reign became one of the strangest and most controversial in Egyptian history. Akhenaten elevated the Aten, the solar disk, above Egypt's traditional gods. The Aten was shown as a disk whose rays ended in hands, offering life to the royal family. Akhenaten changed his name. He founded a new capital called Akhenaten, now known as Amarna. He shifted royal art. He attacked or reduced the status of Amun and other traditional gods. He redirected or closed temple institutions. He placed himself and his family at the center of access to the divine. Egyptian religion had always honored the sun, but Akhenaten pushed solar worship in a radical direction. Was Atenism monotheism? The answer is debated. Akhenaten clearly elevated Aten above other gods. He suppressed some traditional cults. He attempted to focus state religion around one supreme solar deity, but other divine beings did not instantly disappear from popular practice. The king remained the central mediator. Atenism did not become a lasting community-based religion after Akhenaten's death. Some scholars call it monotheism. Some call it monolatry, the exclusive worship of one deity without necessarily denying all others. Some call it henotheism, the elevation of one deity above the rest. Some describe it as a radical royal solar cult. Whatever label is used, the reform shook Egypt. Akhenaten's revolution threatened old temple powers, especially those connected to Amun. It changed the relationship between king, god, priesthood, art, and state. But it did not last. After Akhenaten died, Tutankhamun and later rulers restored the old gods. Amarna was abandoned. Akhenaten and his immediate successors were later erased from official king lists. Egypt tried to forget him, but history did not. His failed revolution became one of the most fascinating experiments in ancient religion. A moment when a pharaoh tried to reorder the heavens. Section 11. Ramesses II and the Theatre of Kingship. Around 1279 BCE, Ramesses II became pharaoh. He ruled for about 66 years, long enough to cover Egypt and Nubia with his name, long enough to build a legend. Ramesses II became one of the most visible kings in ancient history. His monuments appear across Egypt: Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, additions at Karnak, additions at Luxor, temples and statues throughout Egypt and Nubia. Ramesses, his royal residence in the Nile Delta. Some monuments were newly built, others were expanded, others were restored, some were reinscribed with his name. Ramesses understood something powerful about kingship. A ruler must not only rule, he must be seen ruling. He must be remembered. His name must endure on stone. His image must stand larger than life. His victories must be carved where future generations can see them. Ramesses campaigned in the Levant, Libya, and Nubia, but his importance rests not only on warfare, it rests on construction, diplomacy, propaganda, longevity, international politics, royal self-presentation. Later in his reign, Egypt and the Hittite Empire established a formal treaty and royal marriage alliance. Ramesses was not only a warrior king, he was a diplomatic king, a monument-building king, a master of image. His reign also gives us glimpses of ordinary skilled labour. At Deir el-Medina, artisans built royal tombs. Their records preserve wages, property disputes, illness, family life, and even one of history's earliest known labour strikes. This is the other side of monumental Egypt. Behind the colossal statues were workers, behind the temples were tools, behind royal eternity were human hands. Ramesses II became an enduring symbol of Egyptian kingship because he understood the politics of memory. He made himself difficult to forget. Section 12. The Battle of Kadesh. Around 1274 BCE, Ramesses II marched north into Syria. His enemy was the Hittite king Muwatalli II. The prize was Kadesh. Kadesh stood near strategic routes connecting Egypt, Canaan, coastal Syria, inland Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Whoever controlled Kadesh influenced the balance of power between Egypt and Hatti. Ramesses advanced with several army divisions, but the Hittites used deception. According to Egyptian accounts, Hittite agents gave false information, suggesting that the Hittite army was far away. Ramesses moved ahead before all his forces were properly concentrated. Then Hittite chariots crossed the Orontes River and struck the Egyptian camp. The Egyptian position nearly collapsed. Ramesses found himself in danger. Then the Egyptian inscriptions transformed the story into royal drama. Ramesses stands almost alone, the perfect warrior, the king chosen by the gods. He rallies, he fights, he defeats multitudes. He saves Egypt through personal courage. But royal inscriptions are never neutral. They are propaganda. The battle did not end in a clear Egyptian strategic victory. Egypt avoided disaster. Ramesses survived. He withdrew, but the Hittites retained Kadesh. The contested Syrian territory did not become permanently Egyptian. In strategic terms, the battle was inconclusive. Yet politically, Ramesses turned it into a triumph. He carved the story on temple walls. He made the near disaster into a victory of divine kingship. About 15 years later, Egypt and Hatti concluded a formal peace and mutual defense treaty. Copies survive in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform. It is often called one of the earliest surviving international peace treaties. The Battle of Kadesh. Section 15. Iron begins to spread. After 1200 BCE, iron production began spreading more widely across parts of Western Asia and the Mediterranean. But iron did not instantly defeat bronze. That is one of the great misunderstandings of the Iron Age. Early iron was not automatically better. Poorly made iron could be soft, brittle, inconsistent, and difficult to work. Bronze was still effective. Bronze could be cast more easily. Bronze remained useful for weapons, tools, armor, vessels, and decoration. Iron's advantage came later, as metalworkers improved their techniques. They learned bloomery smelting, repeated forging, slag removal, carburization, heat treatment, quenching. Iron also had one enormous long-term advantage. Iron ore was much more common than tin. Bronze depended on copper and tin often had to travel long distances through vulnerable trade networks. After the Bronze Age collapse, those networks were disrupted. Iron offered the possibility of using more widely available local resources, but the spread was gradual. Different regions entered the Iron Age at different times. In Western Asia and parts of the Mediterranean, iron became increasingly important between roughly 1200 and 900 BCE. In other regions, the transition happened later. Iron did not create the New World by itself, but it became one of its tools. The Bronze Age had depended on far-reaching elite exchange. The Iron Age would allow different political communities to arm, farm, build, and expand with a more accessible metal. The world was changing from palace systems to new kingdoms, and iron helped shape that transformation. Section 16. The Zhou Conquest and the Mandate of Heaven. Around 1046 BCE, in China, the Zhou defeated the Shang. The Zhou originated west of the main Shang territories. Under King Wen and King Wu, they built alliances and challenged the last Shang ruler. At the Battle of Muye, King Wu defeated the Shang and established the Western Zhou dynasty. The exact year is debated, but the mid-11th century BCE marks one of the major turning points in Chinese history. The Zhou needed to explain why overthrowing the Shang was legitimate. They developed an idea that would become one of the most important political doctrines in Chinese civilization: the mandate of heaven. The argument was powerful. Heaven grants authority to a virtuous ruling house. A king must govern properly. A corrupt ruler can lose heaven's support. If a dynasty becomes oppressive, immoral, or disorderly, heaven can withdraw its mandate. A successful new dynasty can claim that heaven has chosen it. This was not the same as saying one royal bloodline had an eternal divine right to rule. The mandate of heaven made political legitimacy conditional. Power depended on moral order. Dynastic change could be justified. Rebellion could be legitimate if the old dynasty had failed. The Zhou used this doctrine to explain why the Shang deserved to fall and why Zhou rule was righteous. Western Zhou government depended on royal relatives, hereditary lords, military allies, and regional lineages. The king granted lands and authority. Local lords owed loyalty, tribute, and military support. This system is sometimes called feudal, but it differed from medieval European feudalism. Bronze inscriptions from the Zhou period recorded appointments, gifts, military achievements, and relationships between kings and aristocratic families. The Zhou did not simply conquer territory. They created a political language that would shape Chinese history for millennia. The mandate of heaven became a framework for judging rulers, explaining collapse, and legitimizing new dynasties. In China, law, ritual, kingship, ancestry, and morality became tied to the order of heaven. Section 17. Israelite monarchy and the House of David. Around the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, Israelite communities in the highlands of Canaan developed monarchical institutions. Israelite identity